Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
This winter, we published a new issue of Palladium magazine. The latest print edition, issue 19, has the title of Long History. Now, those who have followed my output over the years know that this is a topic that I'm very interested in, and it's a phrase that I coined back in the day. It is basically the observation that the history of complex human society is actually much longer than we previously thought. And even if we do not have written sources, so it's technically prehistory, right? Because prehistory is what happens before written sources. That term is misleading because we imagine that era to be sort of a primitive state of non-differentiated societies, right? Like simple groups of people, maybe literally cavemen. In reality, we probably had states, cities, villages, continent spanning trade. And this issue collects some of the best articles on this topic that I could find. So I'm happy to dive into each of those and briefly highlight some of the authors and their thinking as we go through it.
Yeah, let's do it. Maybe let's start with one of them you found particularly remarkable, and we can go from there.
Well, first one, I would just point out that the opening essay is my essay on why civilization is longer than we thought. That was honestly one of my favorite articles. I had most fun researching it, writing it. I had most fun thinking about it. It crystallized many thoughts. And then also was an example of work that I had done just traveling to Göbekli Tepe itself and other archaeological sites and visiting them. That topic I think we covered in a previous episode, but just to sort of recapitulate the story, it's again this observation that the previous paradigm of the origin of complex society puts the beginning with the dawn of the cultivation of grains, right? Some people would even say the dawn of agriculture, but there are good reasons to believe that grain was in fact not the first domesticated plant and was perhaps not the first the first time in human history we adopted sedentary life altogether. You, in fact, do not need to domesticate any plants to live in the same village or the same location year after year without migrating. You might be replenished by frequent and abundant migrations of megafauna, as we know existed during the last ice age in both Eurasia and North America. But even more straightforwardly, you might have a setup that is more akin to a fishing village. And we know that people have sailed around the world and settled distant places for a very long time, tens of thousands of years, possibly hundreds of thousands. And this brings me to the first article of the issue that I have not yet written. So that I didn't write, that it was written by a different author. This one is titled Mariners at the Dawn of History. In this article, Tristan Sobrap basically makes an overview of the evidence of ancient human travel across seas and oceans. Not just in the Neolithic, that is the New Stone Age, but the Mesolithic and Paleolithic. The sort of conventional wisdom has been that hunter-gatherers were reluctant seafarers if they went and traveled on the seas at all. And this is sort of seemingly backed up by an absence of archaeological evidence. But honestly, that absence of archaeological evidence is easily explained by the fact that sea levels rose substantially at the end of the last ice age. If there were fishing villages from 20,000 years ago, we would find scant evidence of them because there is no part of the world where the shoreline is the same as it was 20,000 years ago. We do have a lot of circumstantial evidence. For example, we know that archaic hominids were already settling southeastern Asia. Now, some of those areas were connected to the Asian mainland the whole region has a term called, I think, Sundaland, right? So there is a whole lost subcontinent of Eurasia, comparable in size to India, that has been fragmented into the various islands of various islands in modern day Indonesia. However, again, 800,000 years ago, uh, primitive man, Homo erectus, ended up living on the island of Flores. And that's sort of where Homo florensis evolved later, the Flores hobbit. So that's an interesting example of a human that developed very diminutive stature, and basically ended up being a very, very short human. I think they were something like 4 feet tall and much less intelligent, probably, than modern humans. They're an example of island dwarfism, where large mammals such as elephants, but also other animals such as horses and so on, shrink in stature once limited to a small ecosystem on an island. Now, of course, if we're talking about 800,000 years ago, uh, like the Floor's Hobbit, had to have had time to evolve these features. So let's say, to be, very, very conservative, the Floor's Hobbit likely arrived, or their ancestors likely arrived there 1 million years ago. Now, this is crossing, I think, during that time period, 19 kilometers of open ocean with fast currents in between. Even today, that area of sea and ocean is not easy to traverse. Consider for a second how isolated Australian Aborigines were in Australia, and were seemingly not really contacted, and the area was not settled by the seafaring peoples of Southeastern Asia in the modern era. So, again, even seemingly small distances of ocean can be difficult to traverse. Now, this leaves open the possibility that what we had here was sort of a chance crossing of the straits. But it's hardly the only example. We have example in the Mediterranean of pre-Homo sapiens crossing seas to come to isolated islands. On the island of Crete in modern-day Greece, there's evidence of habitation going back 130,000 years. So that's not only, this is before the last ice age. It's not just during the last ice age. And there's disputed evidence, debated whether it is human settlement or not, upwards of 700,000 years. The Cyclades Islands north of Crete also have sites containing evidence of human habitation of 250,000 years ago. During the depth of the Ice Age, these islands were larger and were united into a single greater landmass, so perhaps comparable to Crete. And, the island was home to a large species of dwarf elephant. So an example of the island dwarfism we discussed earlier. But the sea crossing from the Aegean mainland to this island would have been at least 15 kilometers as well. Again, the artifacts in Crete are Middle and Late Pleistocene, and they include stone tools. So we can be fairly sure that some humans were there. There's probable Neanderthal settlement as well. The ancient Mediterranean was, was colonized and inhabited, it seems, by several subsequent waves of humanity, both like originally Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and then Homo sapiens. Now, how precisely they arrived is much less clear. People propose basically, the chance voyages, the drift voyages that we discussed earlier. But there is, for example, evidence that, you could have simple rafts traverse seas and oceans. So the technology is not that advanced. There was a project called the First Mariner Project in 1996, where a team of the Australian prehistorian Robert G. Bednarek assembled a simple 11.4 meter bamboo raft, and they successfully crossed several ocean gaps. The second voyage was, I think, the successful one. So it wasn't a sure bet. Modern mariners trying to reconstruct the journey of Stone Age man had to practice. But I think it establishes that if there were seafaring rafts, you could do something like, cross between two islands in Indonesia, or, for example, to go from the island of Bali to the Lesser Sundas, which is the voyage that Professor Bednarek's team carried out. I think that, you know, the Ryukyu Islands are perhaps one of the strongest cases for what must have been intentional voyages, intentional sea voyages. There was a fish hook made from mollusk shells, and it was dated to 23,000 years ago. Now, the Ryukyu Islands are, they're pretty far away. They're separated from Taiwan by a deep 110-kilometer wide strait. So again, the circumstantial evidence here is much, much stronger than in the previous examples. We have 110-kilometer distance. We have evidence of fishing equipment. And, I think the most straightforward way for people to have arrived at the island was people just blown off course using simple fishing boats. We know even today that people in the 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century, sailors could be blown off course by quite a distance. And with such an abundant source of seafood, I think there's no reason to assume that fishing boats were not used quite ubiquitously. So, for those interested in examining even further evidence, I warmly recommend just reading the article. It was a very interesting article to edit. It was an interesting article to do some deeper research on. But I think it's important because it both changes the story of how ancient humans got their food, but also how ancient humans got where they were. And if the world was actually had a deeper prehistory of globalization with human waves over and over repopulating the world, sometimes replacing previous waves of inhabitants, which, mind you, in the recent discussion of Greenland, you might have heard the Inuit people described as, the indigenous people of the island. Actually, they replaced a previous, completely unrelated culture called the Thule culture. And that wave of Native Americans actually, settled Greenland, was replaced by Vikings, faded into obscurity. And by the time the Vikings departed, by that time only the Inuit arrived. So in a very real sense, the Vikings themselves were in Greenland before the modern Inuit. And perhaps all islands through history have this pattern of habitation where peoples settle them over and over again, displacing previous cultures with previous technological packages. And perhaps the most interesting, observation here is that while we think of Vikings as basically a medieval people, as a technologically more advanced people, the Inuit probably had the better technological package for surviving in Arctic conditions, independent of the trade network that, the Vikings relied upon. I think that in the near future, underwater archaeology over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, especially with the use of drone submersibles, possibly, with the help of AI, possibly with the help of superior underwater sensors developed first and foremost for military purposes, perhaps we will chart some of these underwater finds. For now, at least, we are stuck with these very chance finds because, training divers in archaeology or training archaeologists in underwater techniques, these make for very expensive digs, very expensive, time-consuming digs, and also digs that are, very much at the mercy of weather conditions. So we really have done only a trivial amount of underwater archaeology. I don't think there's a good reason to assume that humans that are archaic humans did not arrive in modern day Australia or the New World before Homo sapiens. And if that's true, then the evolutionary history of the New World and of Australia is much more interesting and complicated than we previously thought. And this brings me to two other articles. There's an article by Razik Khan, who is like excellent writer, excellent understanding of genetics, has a blog called Gene Expression, and also has a Substack. I warmly recommend following it. He wrote an article titled The Native Americans Before Native Americans. And it seems that there's actually, at this point, genetic and archaeological evidence that humans came to the New World. So this is modern humans, so not the archaic hominids we were discussing up until now, but modern humans arrived before the Bering Land Bridge. And, that's very interesting because until recently, we assumed that humans only arrived during the last ice age when the Bering Bridge was crossable by foot. But the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests something closer to 30,000 years ago. The most notable find is in White Sands National Park in Arizona, where footprints were uncovered and dated to I think something like 30,000 years ago. But I'll double check. It's been a little bit since I read the article. The dates are all greater than 20,000 years, though there's some disputed techniques would suggest 26,000 years as a plausible date. And there's also evidence of genetic introgression in populations in the modern day, Brazilian rainforest, which predate the Bering Land Bridge. And they seem to be genetically related not just to modern Native Americans, who represent a substantial fraction of their ancestry, but have an unusual connection to populations in Southeast Asia. So the story that currently seems to be the most consistent with evidence is that the Americas were perhaps first settled not by the Paleo-Siberian ancestors of modern-day Native Americans, but perhaps first settled by peoples not too distantly related to Australian Aborigines or perhaps populations such as the Melanesians, and were later replaced by the Paleo-Siberians who arrived over the Bering Strait much later with, again, new technology. I warmly recommend reading the article. It's a very interesting sort of overview of all of the surprising connections between the New World and the Old. Here's a fun one. Mainstream history believes that the Inuit of Alaska adopted laminar armor from the Japanese, basically in historical time. So that the laminar armor invented in Japan sort of spread to the peoples of Kamchatka. And then through intermittent trade, this type of armor was picked up by the Inuit living in Alaska. And another fun point, the Native Americans living in Alaska were actually known by the inhabitants, the Native Americans of the west coast of the U.S., for coming down in big canoes and basically conducting slave raids and being a very warlike people. So it's kind of funny, right? To imagine that half a world away from, Scandinavia, something very Viking-like developed as a culture. Heavy armor, boats raiding other peoples for loot and for free labor.
That is pretty funny.
Yeah. And then, there are all sorts of interesting questions about where did that other pre-Siberian population and that pre-Siberian genetic signature come from. And Razib writes about it in his piece, which was honestly for me one of the best pieces. I loved reading it. I loved researching it. I loved editing it. And some of the hypotheses are that sort of Melanesians just crossed the Pacific, right? That they just straightforwardly island hopped. The way later Polynesian population groups would. It's likelier, in my opinion, and it's likelier in the opinion of others, that, however, they sort of island hopped through the Arctic area, right? So that they went sort of from modern day Japan past Kamchatka through the sort of islands and just followed fishing and hunting from island to island. And then spreading by the coast, they seem to have spread very rapidly because there was, this massive push southward. you look at the genetics of the people of, you know, there's a clear genetic divide in the world to the east of India, Southeast Asia, between a north and a south population that seems to date to about 40,000 years ago. About 40,000 years ago, the sort of like ancestors of modern East Asian populations started settling and inhabiting this area. But before that, the sort of range of the population that we would recognize as the ancestors of Melanesians stretch out much further, including Taiwan, but probably modern day Japan as well. So, the geography and the cultural geography of the world moves back and forth over and over again. And this is also part of what's explored for the old world in Razib Khan's other article in this issue of Palladium. This one is titled Genomics Has Revealed an Age Undreamed of, which is kind of a reference to Conan the Barbarian, right? The sort of opening lines of the Conan movie and sort of the fictional books. That history might be more real than the history that anthropologists have, upregulated and decided to promote, where perhaps human history has been much more violent than previously assumed. In the old world, there is, thanks to genetics, evidence now over and over again of a near total displacement of populations, where people might live somewhere for 20 or 30,000 years and then come a new people with new technologies and completely replaces the previous one. The anthropological preferred model was that pots, not people, travel, right? And that there is no population replacement, because that sort of implies that human history was more violent. And it seems that human history, in fact, was violent, at least in the Neolithic, long before the discovery of bronze, long before slavery, long before sort of other aspects of what we think of as agrarian civilization. And in this regard, I think the classic Marxist model, and I do mean Marxist in a technical, not a pejorative sense, of society, having originated in primitive communism, went through a phase of slavery and feudalism when accumulation began and became inegalitarian, developed into capitalism, and then in the future, distant future, develops to some sort of post-scarcity advanced communism. That's sort of the basic story of human development and the great arc of human history that sort of was first posited by Marx and then implicitly picked up by most anthropologists of the 20th century. Rather, it seems that people formed war bands. And again, there is even archaeological evidence, not just genetic evidence of this. You have examples of basically massacres. And we can debate whether these are human sacrifice or whether these are, people buried after battle. But they're individuals who have stone axe wounds, cracked skulls, broken limbs, and they're sort of buried in this unorganized way. And you have finds like this that go back 20 or 15,000 years ago. And in some places, some of these battles have 100 casualties, right? Or more. So either this is an execution of people after a battle, or this is, just a disposal of bodies after the battle itself. So I think this is hardly surprising for people who might have had a more Hobbesian view of human evolution and history. And I think that also says things that are more hopeful than just this acknowledgement that sort of violence was part of human nature and is not to be attributed just to a single economic system. I think the more hopeful aspect is that we have been part of organized societies and complicated structures for, several thousand years at this point. And perhaps we are better suited to complex society than we might think. A common evolutionary psychology story is that we feel so out of place and our society has all of these dysfunctional aspects because we never really evolved to live beyond our immediate kin, beyond the 150 people of Dunbar's number. Yet this evidence seems to suggest that there was long distance trade between Siberia and the Middle East, long distance migrations, sea travel, and also organized warfare. And, if you have groups of hundreds of people, this goes beyond Dunbar's number. So there must have been at least tribal alliances of a few thousand. And people would, bring and encounter people that were completely unrelated. So at the very least, I think perhaps the scale of society in which Homo sapiens evolved has been greatly underestimated. There are a few other interesting reflective pieces in this issue of Palladium magazine. There's, one that questions whether we are even the right civilization to undertake this kind of investigation, whether perhaps archaeology itself isn't the sort of unique practice that was developed rather than something all societies will pursue. I think Ben Landau Taylor's article, Will Future Civilizations Bother to Excavate Our Remains, is a very timely article because it posits and it goes through this historic evidence that actually only a few societies bothered to systematically dig up and catalog and document remnants of the past. It's an article I warmly recommend. And then there was another article by Jack Mungo titled The Birth and Burial of Evolutionary Science in Australia, which examines the politics of so-called return of artifacts and remains to Native American, sorry, not to Native to Native Australian populations. However, there's no genetic evidence, and there's very little evidence at all that the skulls, once we're talking about skulls that are 20 or 30,000 years old, are at all related to modern Australian Aborigines, let alone any organized political group. And secondly, when we talk about the return and reburial of these artifacts, they're not stored in sort of a museum that's not run by the Australian government, but's run by the community. Rather, they are reburied in soil where they're very likely to be destroyed because fossils are very fragile. So unless you bury tools and you bury remains in sort of the exact same conditions that preserve them, they will be destroyed very quickly, possibly as soon as a few decades. So because of that, there's really no reason to dig up anything in Australia at all or investigate the prehistory if the end result is that anything that is found will not be genetically tested and will be reburied eventually for destruction. Perhaps we just have to wait for sort of Australian politics to change and decide that actually, by destroying all evidence, scientific evidence of the past, we're not actually doing a favor to the Australian Aborigines. We're actually engaging in cultural vandalism with more steps. Cultural vandalism where modern day peoples who have a very faint cultural connection to the past, who sometimes are often majority European in ancestry, appoint themselves representatives of peoples that have disappeared 20 or 30,000 years ago. And I think this is an effacing of the shared legacy of mankind. And because of that, I was very happy to publish this article. And I was very happy that to have Jack Mungo's first article in Palladium.
What I see you doing is like identifying almost an arbitrage or basically a gap in our understanding or kind of challenging a preconceived narrative. And it's funny, you have this piece by Ben that's kind of like a meta sort of analysis of history in the sense of, usually our understanding of a topic gets better over time. And you would think that history is the past. Like the more time that passes, the more we should understand the past. And it seems like maybe the opposite is true. Maybe the further we get away from it, the less we understand it. Was that sort of surprising to you, or I'm curious how you think about sort of this kind of are we getting better at understanding as time goes on?
I think that we have come to a better understanding of human history over sort of the last few decades, the broad sweep of it. But in the very long run, like I think I agree with this argument that I made with Ben Landau in a piece titled "Our Knowledge of History Decays Over Time," right? Where the past just knew much more about its immediate past, and there are limits to our scientific understanding. Let's put it this way: today, in the soil and in the rocks and under the ocean of the world is the largest quantity of untouched artifacts and untouched remnants and fossils of humans that will ever exist. Every single year, there's a fossil yet to be discovered somewhere in the world that ends up decomposing and being destroyed, right? The march of entropy only goes one way. Every single year, there are fossils that are lost, and there's not an unlimited number of them. Will our technology potentially improve and be able to locate such fossils or date them more accurately or extract even more fragmented DNA and reconstruct it with complex computation? Sure, but that does not help for anything that has been completely destroyed. So I think technology sort of fights this rearguard action where it's sort of an orderly retreat where over time, entropy inevitably destroys more written sources, more human remains, more human tools, and then we get slightly better at discovering them. So in a way, we're in a race to discover our most ancient human history. Like it's quite possible not that we just in practice know more about the 1900s today than will be known 1,000 years from now just because so many paper and written records still exist. So many of them have been digitized. But just because we've digitized them does not mean that they will be preserved, right? The concept of a digital dark age is well known. So it's completely possible that archaeologists of the year 3000 will carefully excavate Paris or London or New York, be able to figure out that there were very tall buildings, but might be unable to reproduce the exact skyline of New York City. And I think people just don't believe that, even though I think it's a very real possibility. We have trouble correctly reconstructing Roman cities. In fact, we routinely find new archaeological finds of Roman cities, right? And there are medieval European cities where we have their depictions of the city, but we just don't have any material evidence remaining of buildings depicted. So there are city layouts for medieval Europe, one of the most, well-documented, densely dug up areas where we simply don't know what the cities looked like. And yes, better technology will help fix this, but every single place where, humans have lived for a very long time is a place of constant new construction. And new construction both reveals old finds, but it also unwittingly destroys them. So I think that there is a very real sense in which we have to acknowledge and accept that there are some things about the 18th century Europe that we will know that, say, people in 200 years will not. And there are probably things we know about, say, the Americas and America's 13 colonies or the Native American tribes there that we know that people in 200 years will not. To give a recent example, there was a huge collection in Brazil of basically written descriptions of now extinct languages, Native American languages, and various artifacts. And it was just a few years ago that National Archive burned down. So 30 years ago and 20 years ago, we knew things as a civilization about the Native Americans of modern Brazil that no one will ever know again. So this is an ongoing process. It's happening as we speak. And I think because of that, it's an interesting question to ask ourselves, what's the role of historical memory? And I think part of the role of historical memory is to try to provide the best record we can of the human being in very different circumstances. I think that without this data set, without the data points of history, we can't really figure out where humans are going. If we only know the present and maybe can speculate about our immediate future and our immediate past, we actually have not seen what humans are like under very different conditions. If on the other hand, we have, deep historical records, a mostly accurate evolutionary history, many hundreds of state societies and different politics they had under conditions of agriculture or even pre-agriculture, under the conditions of undergoing industrialization, I think then you can say many more things and we can know ourselves better. So this sort of data set of humanity, I think, is something that we will find immensely valuable in the future. I think, future societies will, with the use of AI and other technologies, come to undertake attempts to model human society and humans in ways they've never been modeled before. So I think the value of this information will keep on increasing as long as our technology advances. The only question is, though, how long will our technology advance? Because one of the lessons of this longer perspective on human history over and over again is that human societies are mortal and impermanent, and they have arcs of a few hundred years or maybe a few thousand years of progress and then inevitable decay and destruction. So, how long does this push go?
Fascinating. The I also want to ask more, also at a meta level of like, how are we doing in terms of how is our epistemological practice of the of history as a discipline in terms of how we train historians, how we sort of do history? Is if you could wave a wand and change anything about the way that we as a society do it, or whether it's in the academy or more broadly, what might you say in terms of how is the status quo, and what could improve it, or if we could change anything about it?
Well, I think that if anything, we are perhaps undergoing an extreme politicization of history that's partially driven just by sort of the economics of universities, but also because of who ends up being interested in this kind of work. Now, political bias is not itself a problem as long as documentation is stored and documentation is cataloged. I think that we should develop sort of a new approach to history that makes use of the technological tools we have currently available that were not previously available. I think, for example, what could do a lot of good would be a grant for a straightforwardly independently funded project to sort of go with LiDAR drones and like map out all of the ruins to be found in the jungles of the world. They use, drones and aircraft with LiDAR, can have canopy-piercing laser, and they can accurately discover, say, temples or buildings or cities that have not previously been discovered that are currently overgrown. We have an example of, we have NAT's uh, scrolls program where a technological solution was found to the problem of how do you unroll a scroll, right? A scroll that has been charred by volcanic ash. And they successfully basically scanned the scrolls and then used AI techniques to digitally unroll them. So we now have sentences and very soon, hopefully, paragraphs from scrolls that were sort of buried in the ashes of a volcanic explosion, right? Of a volcanic eruption in Pompeii. We might find completely new written sources that have never been discovered before. There was no combination of sort of this unique technical talent and this like intense recovery that was provided, that was something that archaeologists were even qualified to do. So I think we should proactively develop new technologies to explore and understand the past, be it underwater drones, be it digital methods of reconstructing scrolls without needing to physically unroll them, where they just crumble into dust, into nothing. You scan them with X-ray and then you take that data file and you reconstruct it. I think that's number one. Number two, I think there should be, I'm not going to call it a venture capital model, but almost like a venture model where I think idiosyncratic archaeologists should just be hired out of university and without university oversight by philanthropists or by some sort of foundation that could set this as its mission to pursue their hypothesis, right? A hypothesis driven approach to archaeology. So instead of, okay, in Turkey, they build a road, the road comes across some Greek ruins, people from the local university are called, they go catalog what's been dug up, and then the road is built over it. What if instead of this, we had archaeologists who have hypotheses about where a lost city might be, proactively be given funds to go find and dig places, right? So there's no hypothesis making of we should dig here because this like city mentioned in Hittite sources, or this city mentioned in Mesopotamian sources, or this city mentioned in Roman, or this fort mentioned in Roman sources, right? There's no proactive digging to hunt for these, mostly because of high expense, but because also universities are very conservative with what kind of projects they approve. So I honestly think there's low hanging fruit in all sorts of idiosyncratic archaeology. For example, when we talk about Göbekli Tepe, one of the most important things was that when the University of Istanbul, and I think it was the University of Chicago, like dug up the site in the 1960s, they found the same stone pillars that were found by people like, like basically by later archaeologists, the discoverers of Göbekli Tepe, but they misclassified the pillars as medieval tombstones. They found Neolithic tools around them. They dated them correctly, and they had the incorrect hypothesis that sort of the tops of these pillars were medieval tombstones that were built over a genuine Neolithic site. It took sort of this kind of idiosyncratic archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, to basically go through these archives in the 1990s and then just lobby to get the funds and to get the resources to give this archaeological site a second look. And then lo and behold, the tombstones turned out to be giant T-shaped pillars, and it turns out that with radiocarbon dating, they can be dated to 11,500 years old. So in fact, the same age as the Neolithic tools. So there's a groupthink problem, there's a committee problem, and there's a resource unlocking problem. And then the last point I would make is I think that we should start doing something like probabilistic archaeology, where the older a find is, the less likely we are to have found it in the first place. So when you find something that 20,000 years ago is the oldest example of pottery, okay, maybe 20,000 is, when we started doing pottery. But if you find something that's 100,000 or 40,000 years old, and you will say a fragment of pottery, I think the update should not be we did pottery 100,000 years ago, because there's such a big gap in the data between 100,000 and 20,000. These are hypothetical examples. Actually, pottery is probably 30 to 40,000 years old. But if we did find pottery correctly dated to 100,000 years ago, it takes freak circumstances to preserve pottery that long. We should assume that human beings had actually been doing pottery for 200,000 or 300,000 years, and just those were not preserved. And we have found this like rare example. Sort of almost let's do Bayesian updating, right? Let's do Bayesian statistics and calculate how likely it is that a material artifact is preserved. Honestly, we could do materialist experiments, right? We could bury experimentally all sorts of finds to be dug up intentionally 10, 20, 50, and 100 years, right? Let's bury 50 log cabins in a bog. Let's construct them and see 10, 20, 50, and 100 years from now, what proportion of them is preserved. And then let's run that simulation both ends. So when we then find an example, such was recently found of worked wood in prehistoric Africa, which was, either part of a bridge or part of a literally log cabin. This is called the Kalambo structure, found in Zambia, and it's been dated to be 476,000 years old. So that's nearly 500,000 years, right? 476,000 years ago. Okay, what does this tell us? The fact that such wooden construction is undertaken, the fact that, you end up having these larger and smaller logs shaped so that they lock in together, so they fit in together properly. I think this means that humans have been building wooden structures of non-trivial complexity for probably like 1 million years or so. So essentially, I think developing new statistical models of archaeology, training people that would quantitatively evaluate the probability and experimentally evaluate the probability of finds would help us correct for various biases where, if we had a representative sample of the materials used during the Stone Age, would we actually call it the Stone Age? Likely not, right? Like, the handle of a stone axe is not preserved, but we assume that a stone axe had a handle. But what about all of these other tools that had no stone component? We think of them as cavemen because they would deep underground caves that even in their era were impractical to access for daily use, basically produce like high quality art, likely in ritual spaces, right? But we don't actually know that they lived as nomadic hunters above ground. They probably were hunters. But what if they built hunting lodges or observation posts or bridges? What if they waged war? What if they traded? We have evidence already of them practicing organized religion, yet we downplay it and call it art, right? These human beings were very much like ourselves, and their societies experienced progress and experienced disaster and experienced triumphs as well. And, I think that we need to start thinking about humanity and human beings much more like we do of other creatures, where, if you find the skeletal remains of a beaver, you assume that if it has the anatomical features of a modern beaver, it probably made beaver dams. If we find the skeletal remnants of a Homo sapiens that looks very much like we do, with kind of a wimpy skeleton, sort of domesticated features, we just kind of assume that unless there are tools found, they lived naked, feasting on roots and berries. The much likelier reality is that humans like us cannot survive in long term, at least, without technologically regressing and eventually going extinct, with the population dying out, without groups of a few thousand people engaged in complex trade and specialization. And I think, with that, let's consider what it means that, perhaps we are not the descendants of cavemen, but village men or even town dwellers.
I think that's a inspiring note to end on. Samo, this is a great deep dive into our overview of the most recent Palladium issue and long history, and some meta commentary on history as well. And excited for the next Live Players episode.
Yeah, I'm very happy we're restarting these now. And for any viewers who, want to have a beautiful physical copy with unique human made art of the latest issue, I think it's my favorite issue ever. You can go to www.palladiummag.com and just find the subscribe button.
Amazing. +1, endorse. Samo, until next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries.